In this book, you write about judicial and administrative reforms and the necessity for that. In the last 4 years, we have seen that the government has not been able to do much on it. What can, for example, a new government in 2019 can practically implement some reforms that we can actually change the system, especially in judiciary and administrative civil services?
I have written about several such issues in the book, and there are literally many dozens of major reforms that we need in the country, and judicial reform, police reform, prosecutorial reform, I think is probably at the top of my list. It's a basic. If you can't provide law and order, in our system nobody can get justice quickly because the courts are backlogged for decades. Even for criminal cases, courts are backlogged for decades.
I think the focus is more on Supreme Court, High Courts, when the backlog is really at the district and...
No, backlog is there everywhere. Yeah. Even if you go to the Supreme Court, you will see that cases are disposed of in 10-15 seconds. And even those which are heard just for several minutes only. That's not how Supreme Courts ought to operate. In proper democracy, Supreme Court really ought to focus on constitutional issues and give proper time to it. These cases ought to be handled at High Court level and at District Court level. Anyway, first of all, we have a terrible shortage of judges. Most democracies have between 50 to 100 judges per million population. We have barely 13. So we need something like 4 times more judges to meet the bare minimum requirement of most modern democracies. Now, the judge appointing procedure has also become opaque with the collegium system. It's unique in the world. There is nowhere in the world that judges appoint themselves. There has to be checks and balances. Now, the reason it happened in the 1990s was justified, because in the 1970s and 80s, the government had interfered and started superseding judges because of their political affiliations rather than on merit. And so the judges took upon themselves the role. The reason the government could interfere in the 1970s and 80s is because we had a British system of no checks and balances. Now, all modern democracies, including Britain itself, have changed into checks and balances, and the NJAC, the National Judicial Appointments Commission, which was passed with unanimity in Parliament, got rejected by the Supreme Court, which was a tragedy. I think the new government should once again build a consensus and repass the NJAC, because the NJAC still gives enough clout to the judges. If you look at the composition of the NJAC, the judges have the ability to veto any imposition of some aligned judge to one party or another. So, but it gives a role to government, it gives a role to the legislature.
Some power sharing.
Checks and balances, because you cannot have this, the whimsical appointment in the collegium, then the cancellation in the collegium you have seen recently. It's not correct. Even Supreme Court judges have started speaking out against it. So if we solve the problem of the appointment of judges to begin with, that will be the most fundamental, but it's not enough. We need to, by the way, to increase the number of judges, we have to make a huge financial commitment, and that only the government can make.
Yeah. I think we only spend 12,000 crores or something on full judicial.
We need to spend at least 30-40,000 crores extra to make, to raise the ratio of judges so that that there is enough bandwidth for the judiciary. But that's not enough. We have to change, we have to do police reform, because the judges can't judge unless the police are doing their job properly. Prosecutorial reform. The police have been politicized, the prosecution system has been politicized. Unless I have made proposals for them in my private members' bills and in articles that I have written. If we do that, if we have comprehensive reform, starting with an NJAC, starting with judicial reform, that you can't have indefinite number of adjournments, and starting with prosecutorial reform and police reforms, then that will be the core of a fundamentally new and effective India, where justice can be sure and within a reasonable period of time.